The Mind's Eye with BJ Turnoff is available on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, and all major platforms. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye, the intersection between history and mystery, the center of science and the strange, and your source for the subliminal to the criminal. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, your humble host of this auditorium of audacity. If you love the mind's eye, you appreciate the time and energy it takes to carve out the 100+ commercial free episodes currently available for free right now. Please show your support and you're going to get rewarded by doing so. All you got to do is press the donate button on our website, themindseyemedia.com. Every single person who donates, I don't care how big or small it is, you're going to get a free unaired show. But the more that you do donate, the more that you're going to get access to more episodes, free books that you select from our own very personal Mind's Eye collection. Again, all you got to do is press the donate button at the top of our website, themindseyemedia.com. Really appreciate it if you do. On that same website, you're going to get links to all those aforementioned free episodes, highly curated news articles. I don't post anything that I don't read myself, like the one about how the launch code for U.S. nukes was, let me tell you this, 00000000 for 20 plus years. That's right. Nuclear war, apocalypse could have happened if anyone just accidentally pressed 8 zeros in a row. So great information like that about our guests. And now that we got that out of the way, let's focus on the task at hand. And that is the most anticipated crime book of the year, according to Crime Reads. Ipso facto, the most anticipated crime interview of the year. We have joining us right now, Liza Rodman and Jennifer Jordan. We're going to talk about their book, The Babysitter, My Summers with a Serial Killer. Liza is going to recall her childhood memories about her charismatic babysitter, Tony Costa. You might know him as the serial killer, Cape Cod Cannibal. Liza fondly remembers Tony as the kind, handsome handyman at the motel where her mother worked, one of the few kind and understanding adults in her life at the time. He bought her and her sister popsicles and made special visits to the secret garden in the woods, that very same place where he scattered the remains of his victims. But it wasn't even until decades later that she made the connection between the two. Since then, she has become obsessed with the case, as too did her co-writer, award-winning author, and filmmaker, Jennifer Jordan. Combined with her decades of experience as an investigative journalist, the two were able to do a deep dive into the murders like never really before. And on their way, they actually solved 3 missing persons cases of women connected to Tony Costa. You're going to hear about all those and all the memories. If you follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Mind's Eye Show, then you know we've been posting excerpts from the book all week. Definitely check those out. But right now, let's say hello to these 2 very extraordinary women. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
All right, so let's just get right into it, Liza. You had a pretty big realization 15 years ago about your personal connection to the infamous Cape Cod Cannibal. Just paint us a picture of your relationship with Tony Costa and then what triggered the memories 40 years later, or almost 40 years later.
Okay, great. So my parents were divorced when I was a little girl, and my mother's best friend and her husband built a motel in Provincetown, Massachusetts, on the bay. Big, beautiful motel, bigger than the area had ever seen before. And she needed people to come and work. And so my mother was a school teacher. And so she had her summers free. And off we went. And my mother worked as a chambermaid at this motel. It was called the Royal Coachman. And also hired to be a chambermaid there was Tony's mother. And Tony himself had 2 little children by that time and was always looking for work. He never had enough work. He never stayed at a job. He moved around a lot. Sometimes he worked for himself. And he was coming back from a trip and he needed some work. And so she sent, his mother, Cecilia, went to my aunt and said, "You got anything for my son?" And, you can always use a carpenter and a handyman. And so they hired him on. And so that is when I met him, was that summer of 1966, when he was hired to be a handyman at the Royal Coachman. and we were there with my mom. And then many, many years later, I had gone back to finish my bachelor's degree in my 40s, my early 40s, and I was writing my thesis and journaling, and I started having these nightmares, and they were all incredibly violent. So I started writing them down and noticing that they had similar images, and realizing that the color orange, which was a big color at the Royal Coachman, the lobby was orange, was in all of these dreams. And there was always a man without a face. And I was always being hunted, either with a gun or a knife or, one weapon or another. And so one night I dreamt the face was visible to me, and the face was Tony Costa's. And after all of those violent dreams, he backed me right up against a wall inside the motel, and he put a gun to my head. And he asked me to count to 4 in Italian. And that is where we start the book in the prologue. That's where we start the babysitter, is with that nightmare. And with me saying to my mother, gathering up my mother and my aunt and saying, look, I'm having these incredibly violent nightmares. Did something happen to me that you're not telling me? And why am I seeing Tony Costa, of all people, in my dreams? And my mother said very flippantly, well, I know he became a serial killer. And so that's how it all started.
Why do you think your subconscious was speaking to you then?
It's a good question. I think I was trying to, I had a rough childhood with my mother. And as a kind of troubled adolescent and then a troubled young adult, I had a lot of half-finished things in my past. And I think when I went back to school to try and finish that long abandoned bachelor's degree, which is how Jen and I met back in the 1977, when I went back to finish it in my 40s, I think my subconscious was saying, here are some reasons here are some things that stood in your way. What are you going to do with them now?
And Jennifer, I mean, you've known each other for a while now, like you said. It's been a few decades.
Don't date us, Brian.
Well, you did it yourself. Technically, Liza did that for you. So I'm not going to take any responsibility there. But you've known each other for a few days now. And after those few days, still pretty fresh. But with that in mind, I mean, what did you think when Liza shared these experiences and memories with you?
Well, when she told me the story in 2005, 2006, right around there, I'd been a journalist a long time, and I was just publishing my first book at that time. And my first thought was, oh my God, this is a bestseller. And I said to her just those words, this is your book. This is what this is what you've been striving to do in your creative writing and your writing workshops and in your creative bachelor's degree. This is the story that will really launch you. And I was flabbergasted because I didn't know any of it. She didn't know it when we were in college back in the 70s. She didn't know the story. So I didn't learn of it until she did. So it was one of those moments of, holy moly, this is one hell of a story. And, Liza, take it and run. And then now Liza tells her version of taking it, of how she took it and ran.
After, talking this out, hashing it out, learning more, did your perception of Liza change at all, Jennifer?
That's a really interesting question. I've never thought of it in those terms, but my only emotion around Liza that has changed is one of deepening respect for what she went through in processing this story and in allowing the two of us to put it on the page. Because I've ghostwritten 2 books with 2 other women, And I told each of them at the get-go, writing a memoir is going to be the bravest thing you ever do. And in Liza's situation, it was that times 10 because of the emotional and physical abuse she suffered as a child. And to bare your soul and bare your history and bare your wounds to the world in the way that Liza has in this book is remarkable. Is such a weak word. It really did stop me in my tracks several times in the process, because there were moments when I had to challenge her on certain aspects of the telling that she didn't want out. And I was like, hey, we have to put that in. And she allowed me to go with it. She allowed me to help her kind of process this through. So, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, Brian, my emotions around Liza are just pure love first. And then, and through this process, this growing admiration and respect for the courage that she brought to the table.
And, I want to say a word about the personal nature of it too, because I think that unless you get vulnerable, and because I had a friend because we'd known each other so long, and because I had a friend, trust was a difficult thing for me, but trusting Jen through this process was important. I'm not sure I could have done it otherwise, but what I want to say is that I think we make a mistake when we think about personal revelation in literature, because there is no such thing as too personal when you're shooting for a universal thread where people can relate, because perhaps people had this very same experience. Not so much the serial killer, but some of the other things that are in the book and that I write about and that we write about. We're really looking to reach people. And you can't do that unless you're honest and unless you're as vulnerable as it can get, unless you take that shame and put it right out there. And so that's what we're hoping to do with this book, is to reach people who maybe have locked this up inside for a long time.
And another takeaway for me was that, something I really felt during the book, reading your experiences, that trauma and violence, it's a cycle, it's a merry-go-round. Violence and trauma begets more of the same. Was that one of the takeaways that you were trying to have bleed through a little bit?
Absolutely. Well? I mean, there were a lot of them. There were a lot of takeaways. There's the mental illness piece. There's the violence and trauma. There's the idea, I joke about it now, but I feel like I was a little like Patty Hearst, with Stockholm syndrome in a way, saying, Jen, it wasn't that bad. And she would clear her throat and try and explain to me, we had a tangle about using the word abuse.
In relation to her mother.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so, definitely not in relationship to Tony, but in relationship to my mother. And so, all of that sort of, all of the tangles that we had as we wrote the book, both good and bad, both every bit of collaboration, and even the tension between us at times, I think was good for the book. Because I think that the differences between, you can feel that tension in the Liza chapters versus the Tony chapters.
We're not going to go over the salacious details. I mean, those are out there for everybody to read about. But Jennifer, just kind of walk us through the timeline of the Tony Costa murders, so they can then juxtapose it to Liza's memories as she recalls them this episode.
Right. So the murders, as far as we know, the first murder was in the spring of 1968. And then the last murders were, of course, the January of 69. So we had five women were murdered in that time frame. And yet there are upwards of 8 other missing women that had somewhat of a relationship to Tony and his timeline that are still out there in the universe, undiscovered, unfound. At that time, Brian, there were 5,000 missing young women and girls in New England alone. So his own attorneys suspected Tony of at least eight of them. So we don't know exactly when he started killing, but we know exactly the date of the first victim that was found, and that was May of 1968. And at that same time that he was buying Liza and her sister popsicles and ice cream and pushing them on the swing at Dairy Queen and taking them on rides in the truck, the Royal Coachman utility truck, out to his secret garden in the Truro Woods, he was meanwhile killing those women and dismembering them and burying them in those woods, in that place that he took Liza and her sister to show them his so-called secret garden. So it was cheek to jowl with his babysitting and his brutal killing.
And his ramp up too.
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
I mean that what I mean is that in the babysitter, we tried to show Tony's struggle against himself. And so we watched through what he was reading and what he was, and also through interviews later, that he knew that something was wrong, but he didn't know what it was. He kept a physician's desk reference close by. And I think that's both about the drugs and the drug use and being an expert at something, because that was very important to him. And also about trying to figure himself out. And there were a couple of times where he reached out to people and just wasn't getting, they were talking past one another, let's put it that way. And so we watch him struggle. And as I did this research, I was stunned by that, because as I'm watching his story parallel mine, and I really, when I started the research in 2005, I really went to do this research as part of the self-excavation. I wasn't entirely sure it would ever be anything other than, a notation in my journal. As much as I talked to Jen, as much as she said, what's happening with the babysitter, I said, la, 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 can't talk about it, don't want to do it, thank you very much. But I kept researching. So as I watched him up against my own story, I watched him try and reach out to people for help. No one really understanding what he was saying. So that's the long answer to your question.
And also nobody really listening, because this is Provincetown in the 60s. And everyone around him is totally doped up and drunk, including him. And so he's out there trying to find help from other stoners and other losers and
LSD.
Right. And the two doctors he went to were just pumping him full of drugs. I mean, Dr. Hebert, who was like the family doctor in P-Town at the time, used to leave black beauties in his mailbox for people to come by and pick up. I mean, this is a time that, I've said it before, but this was a good time to be a serial killer, because good time and place, because Tony disappeared into the wild west of the East Coast. And he just became another just crazy, wild, stoned, out of it. Where's Tony? Who cares? Who knows? And he just, tried to get help from various people, including these doctors, as I said, and yet nobody cared, or nobody paid attention, or nobody knew to pay attention.
Or he didn't ask the right questions either, Jen. He didn't,
right.
But I think it was apparent that he wanted to.
And I think I think the puzzle pieces were out there to be put together if people
but nobody
could take
did
that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right.
They were just too separated. And I think combined with that, I guess kind of a blind eye or as a sign of the times, and he kind of got swallowed up there. But he also got probably one of the he might have been the luckiest son of a bitch ever. I mean, he had a lot of close calls. I mean, with that hand sticking out of the ground and all that stuff.
Really?
So, I mean, kind of a combination of the two is kind of what it enabled him to I guess evade capture for so long. But then he also had actual enablers. In his memoir, he says that his mom caught him mid dismemberment and essentially turned a blind eye to it. I mean, do you think that's true, Jennifer, Eliza? I mean, whoever wants to take that. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Jen, you go first, Jen.
Yeah, I do think it's true. I think it's true because the way Tony wrote about it in his, this megalomaniacal fashion that he wrote in, because it was always all about him and all about what a great guy he was and all about how he'd been victimized by the legal system. So all of the crimes that he described in incredible detail were somebody else's fault. And so the point in his prison diary that describes that murder that you're talking about of the woman and the dismemberment in the bathtub, it was the detail of it and the fact that in that, retelling, if you will, he talks about his friend's mother walking in and being horrified, but immediately saying, okay, we got to clean this up and, move on, kind of thing. His mother was a maid. His mother was all about my Tony. His mother was all about my Tony can do nothing wrong. So it fits the bill of a woman being more horrified by the mess than by the actual murder in front of her eyes. She never said a word. And the way Tony just wrote about it, as I said, in his memoir, there was too much detail, and it fit with what we know about how that woman was killed and where she was killed and how she was transported out to the woods to be buried, and that it had to be in pieces. So all of that fit together with Tony's description of the mother walking in and finding the mess. And so, yes, I think, in my opinion, of reading what I've read, that his mother did know of at least one of those murders.
And Jen makes that point so well. And this is exactly the reason this book had to have two writers. Because I remember Cecilia and Tony as warm people who took me into their home.
And Cecilia's the mother, for those listeners who don't know.
Sorry. Yeah, that's Tony's mother. And so I remember them as warm people. So it was very difficult for me, even with that piece of paper in front of me that Jen's talking about, where he describes it. It was almost impossible for me to make the leap from who I know to who's on that page. And that's really why I think, and I think that probably part of what Tony wrote was true. I can't imagine the woman I knew, Tony's mother, Cecilia Bonaviri, walking in on a scene like that and turning a blind eye. I can't get myself there. And yet, I know something happened. So, and that's the case with Tony Costa all the way along, isn't it, Jen?
Yep.
He what he says you can't necessarily trust verbatim, but the seeds of truth are under there.
Exactly.
And the point that Jen makes about too much detail. It's too much detail to ignore.
And it's too much detail that fits the narrative. Right. It's too much detail that fits into the other pieces of the facts that we know.
Yeah, and it's why we needed two writers.
Right.
It's such a good example.
And with the killing of this young girl that you're talking about in the bathtub, she's the only one that was transported to the scene. Mm-hmm. And she's the only one that was buried right next to the road. So, Tony's not only a son of a bitch, he's a lazy son of a bitch. And he didn't want to carry her further in than he had to, because 120 pounds of dead weight's 120 pounds of dead weight. And so all those pieces, this came together in my reading of it, and as Liza said, I don't have an emotional connection to Cecilia, his mother, nor to Tony. So I read all this stuff and would look at her like over my reading glasses going, are you serious? I mean, what? This is just, and what really, as I think about it in hindsight, is the fact that Cecilia was able to give Liza the love and comfort, and because Liza's memories of Cecilia are only love and warmth and arms embracing her and folding towels in the laundry room while Cecilia hums her tunes. And so I came into this and read the black and white on the page and just said, holy shit, what are we dealing with here? This is a monster. And we'll never know, because so much has been lost in the 50 years since all of them died. And let's not forget that Cecilia dropped dead of a brain aneurysm while Tony was imprisoned and before his trial. So I think she was under a little stress, maybe.
Yeah, and he blamed himself for that, so that's definitely a little karma back on his end. Thankfully,
yes,
a little help in that. Yeah, I mean, and you described Cecilia, Tony's mother, and Tony both as the pretty much the two only adults that you felt safe with at that time of your childhood, and that it sounds like you still can't really reconcile the image from your childhood memories to the information really about both of them right now.
I think I reconcile it. I don't, but it's again, it's the duality of the book. It's the duality of the chapters. It's the duality of the serial killer personality. And perhaps Tony got his sociopathy from his mother. I just don't know.
Yeah, we never will.
Pardon? And we never will.
Never, right.
But what we do know is that the time, I think it took so long to write this book because of that, because I had to get myself to a place where I was okay with the paradox of what I know to be true in my experience and what I'm reading about these same people.
One of the chapters, you recall a memory, or you think it's a fragment of a memory of one of those trips to the woods, his secret garden. Mm-hmm. Do you think that something nefarious was going on during those trips, and tell us a little bit about, those excursions?
I don't think there was anything nefarious going on, and I'll tell you why I don't. Even more so after doing my research, Tony took everyone out there because because bad things were happening to Tony, both in his mind and to Tony's victims. And Tony was afraid to go out there. This place was an old lover's lane from the 50s. It's part of where Tony took Avis early on in their relationship. So it had a lot of lives, this place. It's also, there's a graveyard right there in the middle of the woods that looks very out of place now. But in the 1800s, there was a big church there, which is why the graveyard's there. There's a crypt there. The place has a personality in much the same way that Provincetown has a personality. And it's all sort of, what is the word I'm looking for? Sort of sandy roads, dirt roads. It's an old fire road that was used in the early days. And before there were the main roads, before the roads were paved. And so it's sort of a bunch of different roads that all connect to each other back there. It's a bit of a maze. And so it's a great place to hide. But because of the cemetery part, Tony was afraid. And of course he was afraid because he buried people out there.
Right.
And of course he was afraid because he tripped over. And this is another point on which Jen and I have differing opinions that overlap, but in part, Tony's memory, I don't think Tony's memory was entirely there. And I think his fear was maybe coming from another personality, I don't know. But he was afraid, and he said that to people, that he didn't want to go out there alone. He took all of his friends went out there, all of his girlfriends, all of his boyfriends, they all went out there. So it wasn't a secret so much as the secret part of it was that he was growing dope out there. He was growing marijuana. And that was in those days where you couldn't do that. So that was the secret part of it. And that was the part for me that I honed right in on, because I had no father in my life at that time, but I had a grandfather next door who was a big gardener. So one of the things I learned early on before memory really, was about gardening, about tomatoes, about this, about that. And so when he said, I've got a garden, I said, well, here's this really cool older cousin type guy, and I can relate on the gardening front. So I'm going to tell him what I know about gardens. So that's how that sort of evolved.
And I disagree with Liza on the nefarious. I mean, I, of course, believe that it was nefarious in taking two little girls, and at times her cousins with them, out to this place that he was burying bodies. How can that not be nefarious?
Well, it absolutely was from that perspective, but in my memory.
Right, no, absolutely.
Yes,
but I'm saying that, just to answer Brian's question about, do you think it was nefarious for him taking the girls out there? My answer is yes. There's no reason for a grown man to be taking, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old children out to the woods to show them his marijuana plants, to show them, and to take those marijuana plants were where he buried the bodies. So,
and his drugs, they were stored.
And his drugs, right.
Drugs out there too.
Right. So he had a whole cache of drugs that he stole and then buried in the woods out there. And so, I'm looking at this from a very different perspective than Liza is, of course, not having lived it. So my experience is, check one for nefarious.
And
we were always at the dump, we were always going to the dump, one dump or another. So
God only knows who might be in the dump. We didn't even look there.
Yeah, that was one thought that had to me. I mean, not just the evidence that he obviously dumped in there, but I mean, who knows? I mean, that would be an easy dumping ground. And like you said, missing women wasn't exactly on the top list of police investigations.
Right.
Now, part of that nefarious aspect of it is obviously where was the location, but you mentioned that you felt like you were being groomed, possibly, maybe even as a future victim.
I don't think I felt that way at the time. I think looking back, it was more apparent to me, and a lot of people who we were in the process of writing this book thought that. And so groomed is one of those things that's tough for me. However, you sort of watch it in the research with these other young women he was bringing along. So I think that had I been a little bit older, had I been 15, I would have looked at it entirely differently and would likely have been afraid. But because I was so young, and because he showed me how to blow smoke rings and all that wonderful music in his truck, I just didn't look at it the same way. So when I looked back was when the grooming issue became, and we know that that's what serial killers do, right? They groom their victims.
And there's two parts I want to kind of attack there. One part is that before you said that you viewed him as kind of an older cousin, but and I know this was never explicitly said in the book, but, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I had the feeling that you maybe had a slight crush on him.
Oh, I think so. I mean, he was cool, he was fun, and he paid attention to us. And we didn't have a lot of attention. Plus, I was fatherless at that time and really missing my father. And so he was male. And he talked to us and, rattled on about, one thing or another. We didn't, it was fun. It was the reason I make the cousin analogy is because for people who are listening to sort of, so how you have that older cousin that you want to be. You want to listen to their music and wear the bell-bottom jeans they're wearing and, eat the food there. You sort of, look up to them and want to be them. And that's what it was like with him.
And I think that's completely understandable as long as you're not one of those people right now, man or woman, who falls in love with the serial killer, the one that marries Charles, Manson. So
Right.
I think
Yeah,
we can
draw the
excuse
line
it.
there.
Yeah, we can excuse you for sure. And before we were talking, you kind of mentioned how he's in some ways he's a stereotypical serial killer, but then in other ways he's kind of unique. Jennifer, kind of what were your observations on that?
Well, this is my first book on a serial killer. So my observations were very raw and new. And I have never read the kinds of materials in all of my years of research as a journalist, as a writer, as a nonfiction historian that I had to read. And it was, autopsy reports. And in fact, I went to a friend of mine here in Salt Lake, a physician, and sat down with him to read through the autopsy reports with him so he could explain to me some of the jargon. And the poor man, there's this very gentle Mormon, very devout. And he looks up at me one too many times and said, "This is a really sick man."
Yeah.
And so it was that kind of, getting into the weeds and getting into the detail of what he did and how he did it. We'll never know why, but what he did and how he did it, that for me as a journalist was at one time, on the one level, fascinating. And on the one level, I got shingles. The stress of, and of course, and I'm the kind of writer that really has to visualize my scenes. I have to get into it, close my eyes, and really encompass the scene I'm writing. And so for me to, for instance, write the scenes of the murders was devastating because I could see it. And I could see that Marianne Wysocki running for her life. And I could see her looking back over her shoulder at her dead friend crumpled on the ground. And yeah, so it was, as I said, on the one hand, fascinating to learn, because, as a journalist, you're always absorbing. And to learn what I've learned in writing this book has been incredible, but also just demoralizing and exhausting and devastating and nightmarish, and middle of the night staring at the ceiling saying, "Okay, don't close your eyes, don't close your eyes, because you'll go back to one of the dismemberments." So yeah, it's been quite a journey. But not only between Liza and me and the process of writing the book and figuring out the narrative of the memoir and the omniscient narrator, but also in really for the two of us, and particularly for Liza, because she lived cheek to jowl with this man, was breathtaking in the literal sense of the word.
It's not a book you would write by choice, I don't think. I think I use the word loosely, but called to write it. I went down the rabbit hole and I never came out. And no matter what happened, I couldn't put it aside. And so when Jen came into the process and said, let's get this book out there, let's collaborate and get this book out there. There was when I think about it now, I think about the relief involved, because I was haunted by both my story and Tony's story. And if it hadn't been for Jennifer Jordan, I'd still be haunted.
I think some people, when they look at this, they may accuse you of, just trying to get some fame, trying to get some money with, retroconnectively. And I think that's a normal thing for people to do with something like this. But when you actually read the book, it really just comes off very differently. It doesn't come off like you're seeking attention. It seems like you're getting something off your chest and hopefully being able to help people by telling your story and connecting it to this. So I think, how do you respond to people when they say something like that to you?
Well, I know, I understand why they would think it, I might think it too if I were outside the process, but I just know in my heart, and Jen does too, I know, that, you know, Sunday afternoon over a cocktail, gee, let's write a book about a serial killer is not.
Yeah, and some of the details you put in there, let's just say most people aren't going to own up to that. So,
Right. Right.
yeah, so I don't think it was like
No, but
that.
I understand it. I understand the idea that people would think that. I certainly know that's not true, though.
Yeah.
So, you know, you can't control what other people think.
Yeah, ain't that the truth? And before, you know, we were talking, you know, kind of part of this case and what you've talked about in the book and you're sharing your experience. There's a nature of dichotomy, and particularly with Tony himself. And you know, some of the psychological examinations said that, you know, he has possible schizoid personality, narcissistic. None of them found insane, though. Liza, I mean, obviously you were young then, but looking through the lens of experience and wisdom, I mean, do you feel like any of these previous statements were probably true, that he was a schizoid personality, or, you know, obviously he was probably not, obviously he was narcissistic, but do you think there was schizoid or schizophrenia aspect there too?
You know, I can't answer that. I don't know. I think I was too young to know. I think looking at the research afterward, clearly there's a mental health issue, and a mental health issue that we want to, as a society, sweep under the carpet. As we do most mental health issues, right? We don't want to talk about it. If we don't talk about it, it's not happening. Same is true of my mother. So because I don't know, I don't even know what schizoid person, I don't even think it's a thing anymore. They tried to label him and they couldn't find anything that fit other than the fact that they knew he knew right from wrong. And so he was prosecuted as such. And he did know right from wrong. But as time puts a different lens on that, you know, there was a lot going on with this guy, as there are with, he's a type. And he's a type which we now have the science to start predicting and start saving lives. And so that's another issue that I hope is up for discussion here as this book continues its journey out in the world.
What about Jennifer? How do you weigh on that? You know, there's a discrepancy between the opinions of Tony. Some call him gentle or lovable. Other called him possible killer. I mean, so there was two images of him, by, you know, depending on your perspective. So there was this dichotomy. Do you think that that was actually cultivated by him, or was it really was a true reflection of his mental state?
Oh, I think it was a true reflection of his mental state. Absolutely. I think Tony was way beyond manipulating the way the world saw him. He was a megalomaniac. He was a pathological narcissist. He was, you know, I'm not sure about the schizoid, only because I felt in reading through his documents and the trial cases and the lawyer's notes and all the interviews. I mean, we have so many hours of interviews with him. I felt he really tried to manipulate those interviews.
Yes, he did.
And that's not, for me, that's not, now mind you, I am not a doctor. I play one on podcasts, but I am not a doctor. But I think that his manipulation, his attempt to manipulate his lie detector tests. He had 9 of them, right, Liza? 9 lie detector tests. He had countless. He had 3 hypnotic sessions. He had hours and hours of interviews with his legal team and with the prosecution and with and it just, every single word out of that man's mouth was conniving and was manipulating. And that doesn't feel to me like schizophrenia. That doesn't feel to me.
It was very pathological too, even his speech patterns.
Yes, it was very pathological, but it also felt manipulated.
Yeah.
And he would try on accents like you and I try on hats. And he would try on persona. And it just, so to answer your question, Brian, for me, it did not feel like that aspect of mental illness, that true schizoid personality. Mm-hmm. I think he was way smarter than that. I think he was trying to manipulate everyone around him who he felt was inferior intellectually than he, and he thought he could out-talk, out-debate, outthink everyone around him. And so,
and convinced that he had done so. Convinced.
Right. I mean, right. As you read in the book, Brian, at his own, the last hours of his trial, he took the stand in his own defense and made this rambling, but very passionate and very cohesive argument, in which the prosecution then turned to each other and said, well, so much for the insanity defense. And so, no, I think that he was way too in touch with what was going on around him to be schizophrenic.
Yeah, he always thought he was the smartest person in the room.
Absolutely.
And it was he himself who actually did himself in with multiple, when he was arrested, and then in his testimony, as you guys, explained in the book. And
well, he did himself in with the arrogance of thinking he could take the women's car and somehow drive it away and get it painted and find an illegal, driver license plate. And suddenly it would be his. I mean, his downfall was that Volkswagen Beetle that he couldn't let go.
Yeah, one. I mean, he probably had a lot of book smarts. Clearly, not a lot of street smarts. It's also,
right.
You're always going to sound like the smartest person in the room when you surround yourself with people that are, teenagers and 10 years plus younger.
Precisely.
So I never looked at it like he was really intelligent. If anything, he was lucky and really careless, if anything.
Right.
So he was, like we said before, he's probably just the luckiest son of a bitch, on the face of this planet for that time. And it was also, like you said, and mentioned, that it was a reflection of the time.
Yeah.
And
the incredibly bumbling police forces,
yes,
trying to catch a serial killer. Well, they didn't know it was a serial killer, trying to catch a killer. They found bodies, and yet they never connected the dots. I mean, the P-Town police never talked to the Truro police, never talked to the Boston police, never talked to the Providence police. So it's had these 4 police forces all looking for these 2 Providence, Rhode Island women and their car. All of these police forces had seen the car and nobody talked to each other. Yeah. So it's just, again, just the lack of communication, the lack of maybe attention. I mean, maybe nobody, back to the 5,000 missing girls and women at that time, nobody really cared. And, you had a few cops who did care, particularly in Providence, but they just kind of, shut the books at night and went home and watched the Smothers Brothers on TV. And
well, they had no idea what they were looking at. They had no idea.
Exactly.
The sophistication of that kind of compulsion. I mean, they just didn't know. They'd never seen anything like it. And that's why it's important to put it in context too. I mean, that's what their nights were like. Open the window, put on Ed Sullivan and have a few beers. And they were dealing with something so sophisticated and such a small percentage of the population. Even now, they just didn't know what they were seeing. And it never occurred to them.
Right. And especially Tony, his father of 3, he's a married man living in P-Town. Everybody's known him practically his whole life. And so they all knew him as kind of an oddball, kind of a weirdo, kind of unreliable. But a killer? Not our Tony.
And he helped the police. So, as a snitch,
right,
as you shared. So, I mean, one particular one, I think Meads, he seemed to really, even with all the evidence presenting to him by his fellow law enforcement agents, he just didn't seem to believe it. Because he got some benefit from it. I don't know. I don't like to crap on police work, but I'll say that some of the work in there was excellent after the fact. But, probably before that, not so great, I'd hate to say, but, and that even still continues today, because let's bring it forward. Now in the research that you did, there were some people that Tony was suspected of murdering, and you guys have found some information that, why don't you fill that in? Jennifer, I guess you want to take that one.
We, in researching this book, read every website, every word on the case. And in each of those accounts, there's this phrase, and they were never seen alive again. So when it came our time to write those words, these three women were never seen alive again, my fingers just froze on the keyboard because I'm a journalist and I didn't know that to be true. And there was this niggling fear in my mind's eye. I could just see one of them reading the book and going, yeah, Jennifer, not so fast. Here I am, sitting on Miami Beach with a cocktail. What do you mean? I was killed 50 years ago. So I started digging, and Liza had been trying for months looking. And so we both went into all the different search engines that we knew of, Amazon, Ancestry and Truthfinder and Facebook and online yearbooks and online phone books and marriage records, divorce records, all of which is now online. So to give the Keystone Cops of 1969 a bit of a break, they didn't have the access that we do to really doing some cross-referencing. So after weeks to months, I was able to find a short list for two of the women. One of the women's names was so common that I knew I couldn't even begin to find her unless I found her through her friend, which I did. So long story short, I found all three, and all three had since died, but none of them at the hands of Tony Costa. And so when I talked to the sisters and daughters of those women, they were shocked to learn that history had written their mothers and their sisters as victims of a serial killer on Cape Cod, because each of them had come home to marry and have children and live their lives. So it was one of those moments of, and I can still remember calling Liza and saying, guess who I found? And just, and wonderful, not only for Liza and me, but for the families of these three, girls then women, who we were able, if you go online and Google Tony Costa's victims, these three women will still show up. And we're hoping soon that those webmasters and those researchers will correct their erroneous information, because those three women, Bonnie Williams, Diane Federoff, and Barbara Spalding, were not killed by Tony Costa.
Twisted happy ending of sorts to the story. I know that, Liza, you've gone on, you've had kids, grandkids. I know one of your children shares a birthday with Tony Costa. Do you feel like you're just somehow inextricably linked to him?
I do. That was one of the things back in 2005 that grabbed me by the throat.
And what would you, if he was still alive today in prison and you can visit him, he didn't commit suicide, what would you say to him?
I'd ask him, do you remember me? What happened to him?
Right. That's what I'd ask him. Because serial killers, as with most violent criminals, they come from violent pasts. Mm-hmm. And we don't know who it was that broke Tony's soul, but somebody did. Because, we, and Liza and I, again, we are not psychologists, but we play them on TV and on podcasts.
Or neuroscientists.
Neuroscientists, right. But we have learned that this kind of psychopathy has kind of a triad of influences. And one of them is always abuse. Mm-hmm. So these killers are not born. These killers are created. Yes, they have two other components that are genetic and that are, it's the third one, Liza, genetic.
Brain damage.
Right. Genetic, physical, and the third one's abuse. And without that third leg, that third triad leg of abuse, those psychopaths don't murder. So Tony and the Ted Bundys and these killers in our midst have all been abused. So my first question to Tony would be, who did it? And what the hell happened?
I think it was multiple. It sounds like it could have been possibly multiple people. One was, I think he was raped or by a
Right.
priest. Was that same priest the same father later on that was the one that gave his mother the rights, and he was there for, or was that a different one?
Same priest.
It was, and that's also another helping of karma.
And we don't know that that priest abused Tony.
That's
we
not a fact.
know we know that that priest abused one of Tony's followers, or at least from the followers' point of view. We don't know in fact because we weren't there.
But we
Or
do know that
priest-
another teenager in town abused
Right.
him.
Right.
Hmm.
And that teenager, who's now a 70-year-old man, told us that he was one of many boys who were drugged by, some kind of spike communion wine after mass every effing Sunday, as this man told us, and then taken to the back room and raped by this priest.
Mhm.
So this is hearsay from this man. So we don't know if it's fact. We don't know if Tony was one of those boys at some point in his Catholic upbringing on, Cape Cod. But we certainly know there's a lot of darkness there.
And I guess really here you're going to be speaking to all the lonely little girls out there right now who don't really feel like someone has their back. But, Liza, what advice would you, and Jennifer, both of you, Liza, we'll start with you. What advice would you, give the child version of yourself?
Oh my gosh, no one's ever asked me that. I would give the advice that it's going to be okay. And I know that sounds trite because it's not okay for everyone, but that it's a long life and that there are to speak up. Just speak up because there are people who will help you. I've had a lot of people who are close to me say, had I known, I wish I could have helped, but I didn't know. And I think that's true with people who abuse other people for whatever reason, is that they like to do it when no one's looking. So speak up.
Jennifer, you want to add anything?
Well, Liz and I had very different childhoods, and my little girl, my little Jennifer, suffered in very different ways. And my suffering was, I was so loud and so on stage all the time. I never shirked from an opinion. I still don't. I never shirked from saying, no, you're wrong. I never shirked from, calling a fool. And you can imagine I wasn't a very popular girl. So my advice to the little Jennifers out there is trust your voice and trust that what you're seeing and what you're judging is true. And don't let those around you who want to silence that voice shame you into thinking that you're somehow, you're too arrogant, or you're too assertive, or you're too loud. Get out there and laugh as loud as you can and make your point and point fingers and be brave, because particularly now, this is such a wonderful time for young girls to see examples around them like Kamala Harris and Michelle Obama and all these strong, proud women coming out and saying, yeah, it's okay to get out there and scream from the ramparts, because our society needs every strong, smart, learned, educated voice it has. So my advice to the little Jennifers out there, shirking under the criticism of, shh, just be quiet, calm down. No, don't. Get out there and be angry, be happy, be crazy, be loud. Be loud, girls. Let's hear your voices.
That's right. Preach it, sister. Come on now.
Yeah.
And I think that's two great pieces of advice. And silence, that goes for so many things. And that's really what enabled Tony to keep going and obviously trust your voice, particularly for women nowadays. Truly. I really just can't thank both of you enough for those pieces of, little nuggets right there. And your time and flexibility and patience tonight with our issues before. Jennifer Jordan, Liza Rodman, Appreciate talking about your book, The Babysitter, My Summers with a Serial Killer.
Thank you, Brian. It's been great.
Thank you so much.
Take good care.
Join us for the next one when noted art historian Jean-Pierre Spouts and Christopher Heath Brown, they're going to take us on an immersive dive into the life, work, impact, and sexual secrets of Salvador Dali. Until the next one, be well and let well be. I'm your host, DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for The Mind's Eye.